presenter, Kari Avery from the US CDC, along with panelists Shimwemwe Weah from Africa CDC and Ramesh Krishnamurthy from WHO headquarters. Thank you all for joining our weekly webinar series and welcome to our continued series on incident management systems. We look forward to continuing to engage with everyone through these informative webinars and through interactive sessions. And we want to thank everyone for your valuable participation thus far. And we look forward to that continuing. Just as a brief reminder, through this incident management systems series, participants will be able to describe the features and characteristics of IMS, identify IMS organizations as appropriate to the complexity of an event, manage incident objections, and learn about efficiently operate under IMS in response to public health emergencies. So this is a continuing series, and we will continue to present on this topic for another couple weeks. A quick reminder that translation services are available today through this platform. Please feel free to click the buttons at the bottom of your screen to access those translation services. You can also submit questions and comments to the Q&A queue, and we'll be happy to address these questions during the Q&A portion following today's presentation. So please feel free to share any questions you may have, and we'll get to them as soon as possible. We will also be utilizing quizzes after the series to continue learning and serve as a knowledge check of the information presented. So please note that in order to receive a certificate for this series, you must complete the quizzes and attend all of the webinars in this series. Another brief reminder, just that if you have not already done so, we do encourage you to join the PHEOC communities of practice on Discord to continue engagement with experts and have access to materials from prior series and prior sessions, as well as access to professional colleagues through the link that will be posted in the chat box shortly. In addition, after this session, you will receive a survey about your thoughts on the course. Your feedback is very important to us. It helps us to continue to improve for future sessions moving forward. So we encourage you to fill that out as well. Today's session will focus on administration and finance functions, and it's presented by Kari Avery. Kari is an emergency management specialist with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US. She's with the Division of Emergency Operations and the Global Emergency Management Capacity Development section. Kari serves as a Global Health Security Agenda Emergency Management Technical Advisor. She's responsible for providing program management support for the execution of emergency management activities internationally. She also provides technical assistance on public health preparedness, response, and recovery activities associated with natural and man-made disasters to partners all around the world and in the US. She is directly responsible for coordinating various emergency response program activities with international countries in her portfolio. Thank you for joining us, Kari, and over to you to begin the presentation. We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Let me share my screen. Yes, thank you, Emily, and I hope everyone can hear me and see my slides. As Emily said, I am Kari Avery with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and I'm an emergency management specialist. And today, to continue with the series, I will be presenting on the incident management system, finance and administration function. I'm going to give you a brief overview of this function in the preparedness phase, the response phase, and the recovery phase. The finance and administration function itself is overall responsible for cash flow management and tracking of materials needed for for the human resources, which is the emergency staffing for the response. They prepare the budget along with, in conjunction with the leadership from the incident management system. They monitor and they provide production and maintenance of administrative records. It's important to keep records during response, and this is why they come up with procedures and processes to put in place for record keeping. This particular function out for the funding streams within the country. It's important that anybody working in this section knows what kind of funding is available during a response. Not only country, but then how is that funding used? Mechanisms are in place for that funding to be used. That is and this is the two things that this function will be looking out for. During a preparedness cycle, as we all know, preparedness cycle is the endless cycle. The finance and administration section is responsible for ensuring that all of their staff remain qualified and are available. So if your public health EOC is activated, the staff then could be utilized in the EOC during the activation. The staff usually on the day-to-day operations, they usually work in some type of finance department within one of the ministries. This keeps them, so they know about the finance portion of the job, but they also need to have situational awareness of what occurs in the EOC when it comes to funding sources. What's available for the EOC and how during responses can the EOC leverage that type of funding? Sources of funding to be available for the EOC. It's important that the finance and administrative staff understands what this funding is, what's in place, and how they can utilize it. There's typically 4 types of funding. Depend on your country, you can call it different things, but there are usually typically 4 types of funding. There's a response fund, reprogram funding, supplemental funding, and what is known as resource mobilization. Response funds are the funds that countries put aside other than their day-to-day operation. So response funds are money that's set aside that's readily available to some type of public health emergency. This is separate from day-to-day funding. And since it's only access during emergencies, it's important that the staff within this particular section stay situationally aware of what this funding is. There are some conditions that each country put in place for utilizing this type of funding. It could be legal conditions for when it can be used and under circumstances, how it can be used. Who has the authority to actually access this funding? How is this funding? How is it used, and then what does it cover? What type of emergencies can it be used for? What are the requirements on how the funds are accounted for? What's the reporting requirements? These are all considerations that most countries, is dependent on the country, but most countries establish these before a response. Then you have the mechanisms in which the funding comes through. So 2 types of mechanisms most commonly used for response funding is a standing amount of money is available to be used when needed for a response. And this standing amount of money then is rolled over from year to year. So it accumulates. If you don't have that many responses during a year, it can accumulate. Or if you have a lot of responses during a year, it can be gone and you don't have anything to use for the following year. On an annual basis, a percentage of the operating budget is set aside until the end of the year And then that is then put into a response fund for availability. The thing about when you put a percentage of operating budget together from year to year, at the end of the year and from each year, you probably wouldn't have the same amount of funding available. But at the end of the year, no matter what you use at the end of the year, a mechanism to replenish the response funding must be determined. So how do you get more funding? What are some of the mechanisms in place in your country so you can replenish these funding so you can be ready for the next time? Another funding source is reprogram funding. And reprogram funding is just that, moving funds from one area to another. Good example of that is during COVID. It's been such a long response that a lot of things that was planned in countries, you might have had a conference that was normally planned and budgeted for that could not have been done because of COVID. But due to the amount of resources and funding needs for your COVID response, you might have reprogrammed the funding for that conference to be used for the response. The funding could come from different departments or different programs within your organizations, and it's just simply moving one pot of money over to be used for the response because you cannot use it for what its intended purpose. Reprogram funding have conditions too. And again, each country has its own predetermined conditions. You got to look at who has the authority to decide to reprogram funding. And then at what level of the government is that authority come from? Limitations on how the funding is used. And then what are the reporting requirements? If you're going to reprogram funds, what kind of reports are you going to have in place to keep up with how that funding was used? And then you have supplemental funding. Supplemental funding comes when all your response funding have ran out. And again, COVID being such a resource-driven response, a lot of funding, a lot of countries have been into the response where they needed supplemental funding. So they have ran out of their normal response funding. And so supplemental funding refers to additional funding requested during response. This is unique to each country. Supplemental funding is typically requested after response